Hi everybody, welcome to Gen X Truth. Here we discuss what it was really like to be a Gen Xer. And since Gen X feels they have to move back the timeline of when Gen X was born, which means we weren't having our kids till we were 25 or older, which is malarkey. Okay? Whether I'm the last of the boomers or one of the first of the Gen Xers, I can tell you the truth about that generation. Why? I grew up with it. I had influence from my boomers, and I had influence from my peers, Gen Xers. Now, a small version of Gen X hijacked the hippie movement. The hippie movement began in the late 60s over equality. Women wanted equal pay for doing the same job as any man. We still didn't get it until in the 90s. But the water hoses they turned on us by the National Guard to shut us up sure did a lot of damage. It killed a lot of kids. And it did diminish the movement, but it didn't stop it. That movement where free love was the motto, was about equality. It wasn't tainted by drug lords and kids that just didn't want to grow up in adults. Now, that small clique of kids that hijacked the free love movement of Gen X, they took it to the worst of the worst. They started producing killers. And if you think I'm joking, look up Charles Manson. He was part of that hippie, drug-fueled movement, which was not the free love movement that originally began. Americans were tired of being separated by our sexes, whether we were male or female, and our color. We wanted it out of our country. It was so outdated, and our parents couldn't have a voice because when they tried, they disappeared. But their children, i.e. us, gave them a voice. And we came together in such great numbers, the government could not make us all disappear. So they had to let us have our voice, and they attacked us for it. They used our National Guard, which is supposed to be here to protect the front lines of our country, not attack us, not be used against us. In fact, it was actually illegal when they used it that way. It was against our constitutional rights. And that was something every Gen Xer could have told you, should have told you, but they didn't. Many of us got caught up in the same thing as our parents. We had to work. The economy went for a small boom after World War II and back down into severe oppression and economic loss. This was the real world. Now, Gen X, this small clique, had to come out of that hippie movement that is saying they were a silent generation. Gen X worked hard to make sure that American children were never going to be the silent generation our parents had to be. We deserved a voice in our country. They wanted us to vote. They wanted us to pay taxes, which were illegal then as they are now, even though they've changed the Constitution and made a lot of amendments to it so they could steal money from hardworking people. Our government is just as much of a joke now as it was back then. It had nothing to do for the people. Corporations were fighting over the monopolies, the big businesses that were going in to our congressmen, our senators, and all of our politicians and bribing them with money for votes, which used to be illegal. And if the millennial generation wants to fight against anything, they want a voice, there's your cause. Fight against the lobbyists that are turning our country into the pit of hell and destitute that we're facing in the future because of these major companies bribing our government. We do not live in a free society. We are 7th on the list of free countries. 7th. And the other countries, you wouldn't believe it. Russia, China, escalated above the U.S. Japan definitely did. And China and Japan control our economies now because everything we buy either comes from them, either one of them. And we're buying garbage, crap that breaks, doesn't last. Gen Xers got tired of fighting our government and decided to raise our kids. And because our generation was creating a technological boom unseen in this country before, not just televisions, they went way beyond that and began creating computers. That's the late 70s, real early 80s, that technological boom was coming out of the colleges. And the college kids that didn't vanish because of our government went into their garages and tinkered with the technology until they refined it, and then they brought it out to us, for us to use and share with our children. The government tried to squash the technological boom. That's why people had to go into hiding to create the computers you use today. The military wanted control completely of that technology, and they did not want it in the hands of the average American. We were not the silent generation. We were the biggest mouths the nation had ever heard because we came out in the largest numbers. Today you don't see that. Millennials are taught not to fight for anything that will give it to you. Well, as a Gen Xer, I didn't teach my kids that. And now that I've been lumped into Gen X, I'm in the same generation as my kids. And my kids grew up with a voice, nice and loud, and they were defiant of every rule I gave them, just like you. And when I was raising them, just like Miss Sherry thought, wow, listen to these ungrateful kids. Have it so much better. Do they? The small clique that went out fucking and drug-fueled orgies produced a bunch of kids with no birth control that they didn't want. This is the silent generation of Gen X. And it needs to be shut up completely because it does not put out any truth of what it was like to be a Gen Xer. Now, I rode to school on a school bus. If Slim Sherry couldn't get on it, she was a troublemaker. We had public transportation. We had buses and taxis. If she didn't utilize any of those, either she got kicked off public transportation for selling drugs, having sex on the buses, pissing on our seats, shitting in the floors of our buses. That was the last of the hippie movement. The drug-fueled, because the rest of the hippie movement went back into college and finished, got their degrees. Yeah, they made some babies, but they gave those children as much as they could. And in doing so, they didn't teach them the values of what they were gaining. That's your millennials. Now, my daughter, a Gen Xer, is not raising her millennials to be like that. She took a tougher route. She homeschools. She's a mom all the way. She homeschools her children. She teaches them about growing their own food and agriculture on a small scale so that they don't have to worry about going hungry. This is the result of Boomer and Gen X influence. Not these, I'm going to give my kids everything and anything so they will shut up and disappear and leave me alone. That's not the real Gen X parents. The Gen X parents, when their millennials hit teens, we fought them. We fought hard to keep our children on the right track. But just like us, no, they had to find another course. But they were not aware they had something to fight for. So all they did was turn on each other. We still have plenty in our country to fight for, and our children are being raised not to bother. That's the result of this small clique of hippies that tried to destroy our country and took a good movement about equality and turned it into a drug-filled orgy, blaring music, and no regard for life, including their millennial children. That's a small amount of people. And now they're trying to claim Tupac as their generation. Tupac was born in 1971, so yes, he was a Gen Xer. But he was a baby in 1971. He did not hit teen years for another 15 years, so that put him 1986, about the time his music was beginning to really hit the scene. Okay? And he came out of poverty. He came out of the gangs. He came out of the equality, or inequality that was still left in our country. Him, Warren G., all of them were the last of Gen Xers to speak out against it. That's what made their music so popular. Slim Shady was a grown woman and should have already had a couple kids of her own by time Tupac took the scene. It was not our generation's music. They made that music for your generation, to inspire you to fight against the oppression and poverty of overtaxation, gangs running rampant, drug lords running rampant through our neighborhoods. They came out as your freedom fighters. Are you fighting? Are you honoring their sacrifices like Tupac's, who got murdered by the gangs he was speaking out against? Warren G., he glamorized it first. Yeah, he glamorized it first, so that these impoverished kids could put money in their bank accounts for the first time. He was showing there was another way to go out and earn money instead of having to just go out and shoot and kill each other to steal what little they had. Gen X cannot claim that era, that movement. Why? Because it was the last of us. It was the beginning of the millennials having a voice against an impoverished nation that was oppressing colors and whites and anybody that they could. And they're still doing it. Because that hippie Gen X movement spawned thousands of kids. The only reason they were silent was they ignored their kids. They didn't teach them how to change a tire. They didn't, which I knew how to do as a Gen Xer. They didn't even teach them how to properly air up a tire. They didn't teach them anything. They ignored you. They ignored you, millennials, because they were mad that they had to give up their drug-fueled, orgied youth. And now they want credit for raising you when they didn't. Most likely, it was Gen X who were the grandparents, my Gen X, part of the era, raising you guys. And if we weren't raising you, the state was. And we did step in to keep the state from raising so many of you. That was what encouraged foster care to grow, to provide homes for all these unwanted Gen X hippies that had nothing to do with anything except trying to destroy our country. They brought in more drug lords. Our era, Gen X, produced the largest number of millionaire drug lords in our country's history. This is real Gen X. Now, my husband is younger than me by 11 years. Makes it kind of curious, because I sure as hell didn't have my first kid when I was 25. Like most Gen Xers, we had our kids between 16 and 18. It's when we started having our babies. Now, those who had to give up because the drug lords had taken over so much of the hippie movement and was producing people like Manson, Charles Manson, who went around slaughtering rich people because it was mad at them for not listening to his music and playing his music all over their radio stations or putting out their records. Nobody wanted part of that movement at all. The majority did not want it. The majority fought to keep our millennial children and grandchildren out of it. I'm sorry that there were some really bad Gen Xers out there who now want credit for something they had nothing to do with, like Slim Sherry. When you take someone else's childhood and use it as your own, everything that your generation worked for becomes defiled. It just destroys it. But without us, you wouldn't have the technology you have now. We didn't only stand shoulder to shoulder against equality. We stood shoulder to shoulder to make sure the next generation got the new technology that was being developed. And a lot of Gen Xers had to go into hiding to create that technology and get it out to us. And they took great risk to do that. You want to talk about an ungrateful generation? There's your hippie movement. That was every ungrateful American kid. But the grateful kids finished our schooling, built up our country. And when we were watching manufacturing disappearing, seeing these jobs just vanishing, we used our brains and started creating new technology, which you now use, which you now carry and take for granted as if it was always there. Our generation didn't start with it. We were the founding fathers for it. I won't take credit for that because I didn't create any of it, but it did come out of my generation. And I was grateful and appreciated that we got it. So if you millennials want the true story of Gen X, here it is for you to hear. Now, if you're going to ignore it, then you'll go down with that small clique of hippies that abused their kids and neglected their kids, that call themselves the silent generation. We were not silent. We had big voices, and we knew in numbers our voices could boom, and it did. It changed some laws. It brought more equality into our education systems and jobs. I mean, we're still fighting against that same oppression, and they're trying to rebuild it, thinking, well, this generation's almost gone, and we can fool the new generation into falling for it. And they are. They are. Because a small number of Gen Xers who came out of the hippie movement, I had nothing, and then I grew up and I had to work for anything I got. So they decided to take the technological boom that was created by the freedom fighters, us, and make it out as if it was nothing. We can make more money now, we'll give our children whatever, and they will shut up and leave us alone. And that's exactly what they did. Record numbers of children were removed during the 60s and 70s. Record numbers of children were removed from the 70s to the 90s. So it comes in with the boomers of abuse, gets carried on by Gen X into the 90s. Now, they don't know what the generational lines are because nobody ever really bothered with it until the race wars were being lost in our country, because our young black and white and Asian children are growing up saying, this is not right. There's no reason that anybody in America should live in poverty. Anybody in America should have to live without being able to speak up, speak out against what's wrong. We gave our parents a voice. We didn't mean to. I don't think that was our goal. Our goal was just to change it. But we gave them the voice they never had. My mother told me that. Yeah, your boomer grandmas told me that. And now that I'm clumped in with Gen Xers, I think Gen X, the true story should be told. Listen, I saw one Slim Sherry's post where she brought up a millennial who was reading a beautiful poem. It was very sweet. Young girl, young lady, reading this poem. But it touched on every lie that this woman, Slim Sherry, was spewing about our generation. And I say lies, because they're not even embellishments, they're lies. And then she wanted to glorify the defiant behavior of her teen years by posting pictures of kids climbing out windows to go get drunk and do drugs and have sex. That's what that was. That's all that is. It's propaganda. Because I'll tell you what, in the 50s, kids were sneaking out. You want to know how I know that? My mother ran away at 14 years old, snuck out of her Chicago apartment, ran off with her 19-year-old boyfriend, went to Georgia, where they could legally get married, because my mother was pregnant with my older brother at 14. Yeah, there were still places in the U.S. a 14-year-old could get married. Listen, you want the truth, millennials? Then listen to the stories of real Gen Xers, not these washed up, wore out, overused hippies that want to glorify their drug-fueled, orgy-fueled generation that they're claiming everyone was a part of, and we weren't. Most of us had jobs long before they set the guideline that said you couldn't get a job till you were 15. I had my first job at 9. And I had been raising my sister while both my parents worked. And my parents taught me if you want anything, you got to work for it. And I passed that knowledge on to my kids, who are passing it on to theirs. Thank God. And now that I'm in my kids' generation, well, I am now, according to some of the Gen Xers, I'm going to tell you the truth and squash this garbage you're being fed by a small number of abusive parents who neglected you, had nothing to do with you, and they want to claim it's a justified reason. No, they're mad because they couldn't live out the rest of their lives in that drug-fueled orgy of a movement. It got squashed by us. The rest of Gen X said enough. And we told our government, you better ramp up the drug fight. You better go against all these drug lords that have taken over this movement and are destroying the brains of our generation. And guess what? That was one time the government started to listen, because we were coming through the war in Vietnam, and it was an ugly war. And your hippies that went around calling our soldiers baby killers and stoning them, throwing food at them. So many of them came back damaged because of the fighting they had to do against North Koreans, with South Koreans right there at their side, fighting with them. Vietnam ain't no joke. And we did go in there for a good reason. We were trying to help a country that had divided itself because of emperors that were cruel and abusive. And what do they call that? Totalitarian or whatever. I can't even find the right words. This is a joke for Gen X to come out and say we were the silent generation. The only reason that hippie generation shut up is because they had to avoid prison, and they were trying to stop losing their kids in record numbers. And now they want to claim credit for what they had nothing to do with. I'll give them some credit. You were trying to destroy a movement for equality so you could fuck like bunnies and do your drugs. That's the truth about that small sect, like a cult. And it even produced a cult. Think I'm joking? Charles Manson's cult. He slaughtered innocent people who never hurt him, never did anything to him, and worked hard for what they did have. He even slaughtered the pregnant women. A movie star, Miss Tate. I was a big fan. Gen X, please join me in this war against the truth about our generation. Speak up like we did when we were kids. Our children need to hear it. They're not taught any of this in school. So they're totally blind to it. They don't know what we did for them, what we sacrificed. So they just come across as ungrateful. And now I'm seeing Stockholm Syndrome starting to take a hold of millennials, trying to protect this generation that ignored them, had nothing to do with them, refused to raise them, refused to care about them. So bad, the government intervention took place. For more than 15 years, that government intervention had to take place to save those kids from that small movement. Only because they popped out so many. They didn't just have one kid. They had kids 7, 8, 9 at a time. Just boom, boom, boom. One right after another. And they were feeding their kids these drugs. I'm not going to glorify that part of my generation. Never will. I will always speak out against it. And I'm praying that other Gen X, people like me, some of the first that are still alive, don't let this small clique, sect, cult, whatever you want to call it, get a hold of our kids again. Americans watch their children destroying and murdering and killing themselves with those drugs. You want to know where the drug wars came from? Them. That sect began the drug wars. Not the Vietnam War. It was that sect that took over free love and turned it into some ridiculous. And I say ridiculous because even then it was ridiculous to most of us. This is a small sect that wants credit for something they didn't do, that wants to make their lives sound like they had the childhoods of their parents, and they did not. Yeah, there were just millions of hungry kids in our country, even back during the times of that. But most of those, the majority of those that came out into the impoverished neighborhoods, came out of that movement. Not out of the real Gen Xers who were fighting for equality for all colors, all sexes. And, oh, that's another thing. Millennials, you've made your children so disgusted and so hateful towards our own species, they refuse to even claim us. And now you're trying to say, well, the government says it's okay for my kid to pretend to be a dog. You identify as a dog, here's some dog food. You identify as a dog, you're out on the porch at night. You ain't in my bed, and you ain't in your room. And you're not playing with technology because dogs can't use technology. At least not human technology, because they have paws. They don't have hands. Their fingers do not work as individually as our monkey hands. You want reality? Here it is. I'm going to be as defiant against this movement as every Gen Xer should be. Rebel against it like we did back in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s. And once we brought technology out into the world, a whole new boom began to happen with the last of the Gen Xers. And here's what I'm talking about. Tupac. Slim Shady tried to claim that as her era. Well, the only thing is, she's getting close to my age, so it wasn't her era. Okay? Tupac was actually the last of the Gen Xers. Born 1971, died 1996. And I'm very familiar with his music. My millennial son used to sing Mama to me whenever it came on the radio or whenever he was hurting inside. He would sing that song to me because we were poor. Warren G. First they came out glorifying the gangs that were terrorizing Compton and the rest of California. And his music evolved and changed to go against that instead of trying to glorify it anymore. Snoop did the same thing. Notorious, he was going to stay consumed by that gang world, and did. Now these are just a few of the big names of the last of the Gen Xers that tried to help millennials get out of the poverty movement that was crushing our economy. And they did, successfully. They navigated out of it, but you guys didn't. Young millennials were still starving in bad neighborhoods, being run by drug lords and corrupt police. Something Gen X fought against. We shouted out with our voices about the police abuse. And even back then, the police did not discriminate who they beat up. They beat everybody. And they killed many of us and walked with a clean slate and holding their jobs. My husband filled out a job application. Could not believe. They asked his sex. He said male. And then it asked, how do you identify? Male? I'm a man. I identify as the sex I was. He was just blown away that this was on his application for a job. And I told him, I said, I've been telling you for years that this is happening and you did not believe me, but now you've got the hard copy paperwork right in front of you asking how you identify. Because millennials are like, well, we have nothing to fight for. So we're going to fight for equality, that I can be a cat or I can be a dog. Eat your dog food, eat your cat food, shut up. You don't want to identify it as part of the human race. Bow out and shut up. You don't have to be a part of it. But I got to tell you, these kids pretending to be, I'm a hamster. I remember the Furbies. Yeah. Hey kids, you know those little Furbies you're pretending to be? Those were sex costumes for your parents. So while you're dressing up as a cat, a dog, a little mouse, a hamster, you're using what your parents thought were sex toys to identify as. You're a sex toy now? Listen, you can't change your species without going to the government or some scientist and saying, change my DNA so I can be a cat or a dog. And then you don't live a human life. You don't live in a house. You don't play with technology. You don't eat human food. You don't do what humans do. You do what those animals you identify as do. And millennials, allowing your children to do this and encouraging our government to allow it and enforce it on others, there's your battle. Millennials, here's your fight. Are you human or are you an animal? Fight for your right to be a human now. Listen, if you don't think your children were worth it to fight for them now, then you're probably part of that hippie, disastrous movement that took over us kids' voices for equality. Stop it. There's your battle. There's your fight. Give it your all. Save your kids if you're able, because the government's trying to castrate them now. And they're trying to change women into men and men into women. Legally. They're pushing it down the throats of parents who say no. You want to be a sex toy Furby? Then know exactly what you're trying to be. Sorry, why?